As South Africa prepares to host the 2023 BRICS Summit next month, Business Leadership South Africa says our relationship with BRICS must not come at the expense of our relationships with the West. BLSA says while the opportunities in the East are clear, South Africa's trading relationships with the West are essential to its economic well-being. For more on this, I'm joined by Business Leadership South Africa CEO Busisiwe Mavuso. Thank you very much, Mr. Mavuso, for speaking to us on Newsnight this evening. In your recent article, you bemoaned the short-sightedness of those representing South Africa at the summit in thinking that we have to pick sides between our BRICS partners and the Western countries we for years traded with to the benefit of citizens. What would be the impact on our industrial base if these leaders risk trade deals with Western countries in favor of the East?
So, Anli, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think let me properly contextualize this. As BLSA, we are not making a broad, universal statement about those who are spearheading the BRICS Summit. We are really just condemning and lamenting the remarks that were actually made by the minister in the presidency responsible for persons with disabilities and young people, in as far as the statement that she made, claiming that or suggesting that we are using BRICS as a means to accelerate the downfall of an unjust imperialist world order. That statement is simply not true, and it is actually irresponsible, because we know that the reason why we are actually part of the bloc has got absolutely nothing to do with trying to undermine our relationship with the West. The reason why we are actually part of the bloc, it is to enable us to extend our global influence and strengthen our trade ties with a range of powerful emerging market economies. And that's a brilliant initiative. So it would therefore be rather unfortunate, to use BRICS as a weapon against the West, as the minister last week did. I don't know the context within which she made the statements. I'm not sure what she was actually or where she was going with that statement. But as business, we thought that it would be clear, or rather it would be very necessary that we actually come out and lament that statement, and just remind the politicians that we are in a very critical time, at the moment, especially with AGOA under review. If we lose AGOA as a country, we stand to lose a lot, because we know the trade relations that we actually are benefiting from, under the AGOA relationship. So we therefore have a narrow window of opportunity to make the case that it is in the U.S. interest to continue to give South Africa access to U.S. markets, and insulting the West is not how we are going to achieve that. Our elected representatives have to understand that they have a responsibility to advance the South African cause. And if we don't get this right in the next few months, then it is actually going to be very devastating for our economy. And I think that is the point that we actually wanted to correct from this particular minister. We don't know if this is a view that is held across government. I wouldn't think so, Anli, because we know that Minister Ibrahim Patel 2 weeks back led a delegation of business and government to the U.S. to try and make sure that we can salvage their AGOA relationship. So it is therefore unfortunate and rather irresponsible, just 2 weeks later, for the minister and Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma in particular to then come out and make such irresponsible statements.
In this article, you specifically also mentioned the balance between raw material exports and exports of value-added goods and services. What does that balance currently look like in terms of our relationship both with the West and with the East?
Yeah, so it is rather skewed, heavily skewed and biased towards the West. It was very interesting in the statement that she made. The minister lamented those who prefer us shipping raw materials rather than manufactured goods to the world. But she failed to acknowledge that our relations with India and China are tremendously characterized by South Africa exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods, to these two countries in particular. She ignored that it is Europe and the US that import by far the majority of our manufactured goods, including the vehicles and machinery that we actually make here. For example, 71% of our vehicle exports so far this year have gone to Europe and 15% have gone to the US. More than a third of our exports go to America and Europe, and around 37% of our imports come from there. And lots of these trade relationships, therefore, would be devastating for employment. It will leave our economy far more reliant on raw material exports, which is precisely what we're trying to change. We are currently looking at how we can change the pattern of low value added exports to Asia so that we can shift the trade mix over time to goods with more value added. But this cannot be done by alienating the Western markets. Serious harm will be done to our industrial base if we collapse the trade relationships that currently sustain it without any competitive access to new trading markets. And I think that is precisely the point that we actually want to bring across, Anli. Harming relationships with the West by declaring that BRICS exists to somehow counter the West would do us no good at all. It is simply an irresponsible statement to make, and it is actually not true. We should actually be looking to work with BRICS members to improve, our relations and opportunities for our economies to trade with each other. In particular, South Africa should focus on enabling greater export of its manufactured goods to other BRICS countries. We should therefore present BRICS as an opportunity to drive economic development of its members, and we should make sure that an outcome of that relationship is that which, the West and all other friends of South Africa would see positively. So it is unfortunate that we are seemingly using the East, or we are pitting the East against the West, because going into this block of BRICS, was not the intention of actually undermining the relations with the West.
It's strange that in any discussion where BRICS is involved, it seems that, Russia is the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And this pitting of the East against the West, Russia is very much squarely in that camp, denouncing the West. And surely a non-aligned stance should be exactly that, leaving political rhetoric behind in favor of citizens who desperately need economic growth for survival, let alone, before we can even dream of creating that rainbow utopia that, leaders keep trying to tell the masses is just beyond the horizon of the next election.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is precisely that issue that we're actually, worried about, from a business perspective. And I think we are very clear, that it is, number one, a huge opportunity for us, for instance, to be enabled to host, the summit in August. And we welcome that with both hands. It is absolutely, a positive and absolutely brilliant, especially from the perspective that there is going to be an enlargement of the bloc, which is actually going to enable South Africa to extend its global influence and strengthen its trade ties, with a range of powerful emerging market economies. And that is a brilliant opportunity for South Africa. But we therefore just need to be careful, Anli, in terms of how we actually drive this narrative, because the last thing that we actually want to do, as a country is to be seen, to your point, to be pitting the East against the West. I mean, we still have the huge issue hanging around our heads, of Lady R, Russia being a member of BRICS. So the last thing we actually want to do is to be seen to be continuing the Russia, Lady R, non-neutral stance that we have actually taken as a country, and we are actually using BRICS and actually this summit in particular to actually continue to undermine the relations with the West, because we still have to answer, as a country around what happened in as far as Lady R is concerned. We haven't given answers that are convincing, not only for the US, we are also not convinced as the business community in terms of, the fact that government has actually told us everything that it knows in as far as the Lady R issue is concerned. And I think we are therefore in a very dire situation. And I think we should should actually acknowledge and realize that if anything were to go wrong in as far as, AGOA is concerned, if we agree that the prospect of AGOA is now a very real risk, it is probably not going to stop there. We also have a free trade agreement with the European Union that could be at risk, and trade relations would also be affected with the UK. Our preferential trade agreement with the EU, which facilitates even more trade than AGOA, could similarly be at risk as the EU reviews its policy framework on third country support for Russia. So statements like these are therefore very dangerous, looking at how much South Africa and Africa, in particular, are benefiting from the UK. The EU is our biggest trading partner. Yeah. As a country at the moment. So does it really make sense, for the minister to actually be making statements like these? And I worry that other allies of Ukraine, like the UK, as I've said, are also likely going to look at seriously, reviewing its trading terms with South Africa. And we therefore have to be very careful, especially in as far as where we find ourselves at the moment. We have to tread very carefully. We can't have one set of
Unfortunately, I do apologize. We have run out of time. That is where we're going to have to leave it. But thank you so much for your insights. Business and politics, not always compatible. Bedfellows and our leaders are going to have to choose which element they put first. That was Busisiwe Mavuso, CEO of Business Leadership South Africa.